Hello and welcome to another episode of Bharatvaarta Weekly. I'm your host Nirav Kanodra, and with me today I have Abhishek Paul. Maybe Prasanna Vishwanathan might join us later. So today we are here to run you down through all the events which happened in the last week and more. So going back to last week, we had two interesting episodes on Bharatvaarta. So one was on the Open Network for Digital Commerce, or ONDC, which is expected to transform India's retail sector. And the other one was a conversation with Gray Connolly, part of Valina Stocks, which is talking about the new Australian Labour government. So, Abhishek, what did you make out of these two episodes? Very covering like a wide breadth, actually.
Yes, hi Nirav. So yeah, I think both the episodes were very interesting. To talk about the ONDC one, it was great to have the CEO of ONDC as well as Mr. Koshi as well as Nikhil, right, who has worked on the development of various platforms in India's digital public space, right, like UPI, etc. So both of them spoke very well in trying to explain the whole concept of ONDC, right? And I would recommend all viewers of Bharatvaarta to check out this episode in particular. I think ONDC itself is a very ambitious project, trying to expand and democratize access to digital markets for India's retail sector, right? And one of the interesting analogies that Nikhil Kumar gave during this, episode was that how, let's say, a couple of decades ago, various municipal authorities would open shopping complexes in big cities, right? Like Bangalore has a lot of these BDA centers where a lot of shops were opened by various kinds of retailers, right? And now the idea is the same, to sort of, take this concept to retailers all over India, right? And, slowly, right now, digital commerce mostly happens through these large platforms like Amazon, Flipkart, etc., right? And ONDC is sort of trying to make it easier and more accessible to smaller retailers, etc., while giving the consumers more choice as well, right? So it's a very different, interesting concept. One can always argue that why should government get into this space in the first place, right? I don't think any other country has actually come up with this concept in this space. But sometimes, government interventions can be useful as well, like how big a success UPI has been for payments. And I think the idea is to do something similar in terms of the retail sector, right? And some other interesting tidbits that you can gather is actually the whole background and how the pandemic forced some of India's, public intellectuals and thinkers to think in this space and how this whole thing came about. So worth checking it out. Coming to the other episode with Gray Connolly on Valina's talk, I really enjoyed this episode. Mr. Connolly obviously spoke about the current geopolitical situation from an Australian perspective. He talked about how he believes that the new Labour government, despite being left of centre, will broadly be doing a continuation of policies when it comes to the foreign policy space for Australia, right? But where I really enjoyed this episode was when he started talking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think if we're to check about only a part of the episode, I would recommend checking around, let's say, the 45th minute mark, where the discussion on Russia and Ukraine starts. And to me, he gave one of the best analysis that I've heard on this conflict, talking about what are Russia's strategic objectives, the concept of Nouveau Russia, and how Russia is looking to basically capture influence around the Black Sea, how this could impact even a NATO country like Turkey and make them choose the other side in the long run, right? If Russia and Turkey are able to, capture and influence and control the Black Sea area. So fascinating discussion, and definitely would recommend Bharatvaarta viewers to check it out.
So moving on, since you're talking about Russia, India and Russia are to meet this Wednesday to talk about a new payment system. This is giving finishing touches to the bilateral payment system between the two countries without violating any global sanctions. The two sides will meet solutions such as a Vostro and Loro accounts, which basically is a system where one bank has a account in a foreign country in their domestic currency. So Indian banks having ruble accounts and correspondingly Russian banks having rupee accounts. I think this is a fairly interesting time in terms of geopolitics. If you just look at the whole global oil and gas trade, Europe was very much buying almost exclusively from Russia, oil and gas. And India was buying bulk of its oil imports from the Middle East, India and China. And now what has happened is that due to these sanctions, etc., some of the Russian, so still Europe is buying more gas from Russia via pipelines. Some of the countries have stopped buying oil, and that oil is coming to India, and India not buying Middle Eastern oil. So that Middle Eastern oil is flowing into Europe, right? So it's kind of like a unique situation. And second thing is the payments systems. So the global international payments, the main backbone is the SWIFT system, but Russia has been sanctioned, and hence most of the Russian banks cannot access SWIFT. But Russia has its own payment system, India has its own payment system, and now they're trying to merge these two and have a rupee-ruble trade. We had an episode earlier on Bharatvaarta, whether, will the US dollar lose its reserve currency status. So this Russian oil is still being priced in US dollars, but the trade settlement will happen in rupees and ruble. And India at this moment has a large trade deficit versus Russia. So India is importing a lot more oil from Russia, but India is not exporting enough yet, right? So probably this is an opportunity for some of the Indian manufacturing companies to try and substitute the trade which was happening, say, from Europe. Whatever Russia was buying from Europe, maybe that could be bought from India instead. Also, what might happen is that the balance, once this Nostro-Vostro accounts are set up, is because Russia will have excess rupees, right? Or India is like net short rubles. You might see Russian banks buying Indian assets. So they might buy Indian government bonds or Indian corporate bonds or state government debt. And so this is having like one captive customer. Overall, all over the world, right? Like I think what has happened is that these sanctions came in too swiftly, too abruptly, swift to kind of use the same word here. But that has given a shock to the global system, right? And everybody is now going to look at potentially other parallel systems so that you can't get cancelled, right? So we are all going to build resilience. Maybe this is the first of such other payment systems which come up. Probably there will be something between China and Russia as well. You will see multiple, maybe as we go to like a multipolar world, you will see multiple parallel systems coming up, right? So you don't want any one hegemon. You don't want any one person having the ability, and this was also done without any debate in the parliament in the US or in the UK or the other European nations, that overnight you could freeze somebody's accounts, overnight you could cancel someone from like a payment infrastructure, right? So this is a good thing. Also, if this is very successful, this is one technology export, like the whole UPI payment system. India was already exploring with having lines with Singapore, for example, right? India has a free trade agreement with ASEAN, but these all things coupled with India signing free trade agreements with various countries, Australia being one, UK being another, is like a positive, right? So that is definitely an opportunity. This crisis has given a lot of birth to a lot of opportunities of different systems, and maybe this is one of them. So moving on, actually, I think this is one very tragic piece of news, that one person dead in riots and 13 injured against like the army's new recruitment policy. The critics of the scheme say that this weakens the armed forces and increases unemployment rate in the country. The new Agnipath scheme was aimed at people between 17 and a half to 21 years of age, and was like a 4-year short service commission where the recruits would not be eligible to pension, but just one lump sum payment at the end, and only about 25% would be absorbed. Many people have taken to the streets, especially in states like Bihar, Telangana, UP, West Bengal, to protest against this. Sadly, they've burnt buses and railway coaches in Bihar and Telangana. Abhishek, what do you make out of this? This is a very tragic incident, and like it shows how difficult any reform is in the country.
Yeah, so I think there are like 4-5 different aspects to this discussion. So number one, we are seeing a recurring pattern in the country where reforms are being met with a lot of protests, and some of them are often turning violent, right? And so what happens is, what we do in the past sort of leads us to the future, right? And if people have seen that the government has actually taken U-turns in the past based on how severe and how long and how sustained some of the protests have been, that emboldens other protesters. So, the experience that we have seen during, let's say, the CA NRC issue or the farm laws issue, basically, every previous incident probably emboldens people to protest, and sometimes protest violently, right? Protests are, of course, perfectly fine. It's the violence which is the main concern, right? So that is one thing. It's very unfortunate, but quite predictable now, I would say. Secondly, let's talk a little bit about the Agnipath scheme. I think it's a big enough topic for a full episode someday. But to summarize how I look at it, it's a very radical reform. And the background to it is this, that the armies and militaries of the future will require more technology and less manpower, right? More weaponry, less manpower. That means we need more capital expenditure, right? And less operating expenditures. Now, given how India's current mix of spending is, we spend a lot on manpower, and often big part of that cost is also on the pensions of soldiers, right? The one rank, one pension scheme that the government brought in has also increased to that quite heavily, I would say. So while we did that for our past soldiers, it is a fact now that given how state of things are in our neighborhood, we need more capital expenditure to keep modernizing our militaries and things like that. So net, the fact is that India needs to cut down, or at least stop the pace of increase of its pension bill, let's say. I don't think any cutting down is happening, but we need to stop the rate of increase right now in our pension bill, curtail it, and shift some of our budget into capex, right, for new technologies, new hardware systems, and so on, right? So now what is the government doing? So basically in our armed forces, we have two types, right? We have officers and non-officers. Now for our non-officers, the Agnipath scheme will going forward is supposed to be the only source of recruitment, right? Which means that people who are successful in entering via the scheme will be in the armed forces for about 4 years, and after that 25% of the best of them will continue, and the others will be leaving the armed forces. There are certain monetary numbers at the end of it, which they will get, some of it from their own contribution, some of it is some tax-free benefits by the government, and so on. But if you look at the numbers, right, there are a few things. So essentially, if you look at numbers for army recruitment from 2015 onwards, it ranges anywhere between 50,000 to 80,000 a year. And this is only for the army. Let's say you add Navy and Air Force, maybe the numbers are between 50,000 to 1 lakh per year, right, who have been entering the army. The last 2 years have seen no recruitment. Now, this current year's Agnipath scheme talks about taking 46,000 people. And this 46,000 people will become only 25% of it, right? So about 12,000 will continue. The remaining 33,000 will sort of leave after 4 years. So now if you think about it just in terms of numbers, let's say we take a number of 50,000 average, right? So let's say instead of 50,000 people getting a permanent job, in the previous scheme of things, about only 25% of them will get that. So now what is happening is that this is leading to a backlash, right? Because for a large section of young youth in, let's say, some of India's more poorer states, an army job or a military job is one of the things the youth looks forward to, right? It is a job which comes with great respect. It is a job which is coveted. It is a job also which comes with pension, which comes with retirement benefits, and so on. You are gainfully employed for 17, 20, 25 years at times, right, in the army as a non-officer. And so effectively what the government is saying is that we need less people, and we also want to bring down the average age of the people in the army, and hence this new form. So I can see why this would cause a lot of heartburn to people. I think since announcing the scheme, the government has made a number of tweaks quickly. For example, they have increased the maximum age from 21 to 23 for the current year, because some people would have lost their attempts because 2 years there was no recruitment. They have also encouraged various state governments to say that people who are coming out of this scheme will get preference in state government jobs, state police jobs, so on. There is some talk about certain educational qualifications, certificates, etc., right? So certain amount of tinkering is happening on the margins to make this a bit more attractive for the people. But net, let's face it, right? The fact is that for people who have been seeing dreams of having an army job or a military job, their chances for that are going to come down, right? And that is a harsh reality for some people to deal with. And obviously, this does not mean that you should be getting violent and burning down trains. I mean, it's quite hard to imagine that someone who was looking to become the custodian of the nation as a soldier turns on a dime and starts burning trains if that is no longer an option. It's a fact that your competition basically has increased, your chances are probably lower, but still does not condone does not mean that you should be going down burning trains. Some of the initial investigations have shown that certain coaching institutes, people in coaching institutes have been behind instigating the youth. I can actually believe that because all this is also a linked economy, right? If, for example, less people in 2-3 years start going to coaching institutes, they are impacted. And so I don't know where it will go, whether the government will stick to it or it'll take a U-turn or it will delay this reform to, let's say, one option could be, right, that you say, okay, we'll start Agnipath, but only in 2026 or something like that. I also feel like this is a change that may not survive if there is a different central government in place, right? Because it's an easy vote winner for the opposition. If they say no, everything will continue the same in the army, we'll continue to hire more people. Ultimately, I think what is happening is that we are still not creating enough gainful employment in the country for our youth, and that is basically the crux of the entire problem. And so the social effect of that comes out in various things such as this violent protest.
Totally agree. I think what this tells you, so we've seen farm laws being rolled back, we've seen land reforms being rolled back, even this may be diluted down or whatever. It tells you how difficult is reforms in any form, because what happens is, like, today's deficits are tomorrow's taxes, or today's saving is tomorrow's spending in gainful spending in maybe better military hardware or in other parts, right? But here the gains are like widely sparsely distributed, and the losses are on like one specific section of the society, which becomes a vocal minority, right? And so this is exactly what it is. It is very difficult to change through the status quo. While, like, I think that the scheme was fantastic, but I think all problems, or like a lot of Indian problems, they just have like one solution, and that is growing economy. I would not like to say more jobs, because we can keep employing people, and like a lot of government departments or PSUs are overstaffed since like the 70s and 80s, because they end up being like entitlement schemes or like urban job guarantee scheme, like Narega is the rural one. But what we need is a growing economy, and which kind of absorbs all these people. Probably if this is seen as like a nice 4-year path with about 25% moving on in within the army itself, maybe others getting into jobs within, like, say, border security force or like police force, etc., right? This could be an alternative career path also. Think about it this way, that if you have n number of people having an 18 to 20-year career and then like a long pension life, right? Maybe a 40-year or like 30 to 40 years where they collect pension. You join at, say, maybe 18 to 38 you work, and then 38 to like 78 probably you collect pension, right? Instead of that, you have like 3 times as many people working just for 4 years, right? So probably, in all probability, more people will be ex-servicemen and have a shorter stint in the army, right? So across generations. So in a way, it creates some better employment prospects for 4 years, where you have like a disciplined workforce, which could be absorbed into like the private sector. And maybe some sort of this kind of communication needs to be done as well. that like while a lot of people are burning down because they look at army as like an employment avenue with like a 20-year service and a 40-year pension expectancy, right? And if you just look at it as a higher chance of having 4 years gainful employment and maybe opens a door for like a lot of other things, that could be seen. I think it's one other thing is where these schemes, it's a little bit more communication issue as well. As you said, this is a very vast topic, and we could do like a whole episode on this, right? Which probably we should do in the future. So moving on, Sensex and Nifty suffered the worst week in 2 years. You saw benchmark equity indices fall over 3.5%. This is in a week where you had like a lot of global central banks tightening their interest rate policy. So you had the US Federal Reserve hiking interest rates by 0.75%. You had Swiss National Bank hiking by 0.5%. You had Bank of England by 0.25%. So all of this has kind of led to more money moving out of stocks into more debt instruments. And this is, while we can say, yes, it suffered the worst week in 2 years, but 2 years ago, we saw a lot worse during COVID, right? And what had happened is that the global central banks cut interest rates to zero. They pumped the whole world with money. And a lot of that money came into all global stock markets, right? And right now, everybody is now withdrawing that stimulus. And this is, some of it was to be expected. See, markets don't only go up all the time. Markets go up and they go down. And this is something which kind of should have been expected. I think Indian markets, though, have performed a little bit better than the global ones. And now that like a lot of foreigners had already pulled out money during COVID and they never came back, and Indian markets are driven more by domestic investors. So now the worry will be, which you can look at it in a good way or a bad way. If the fixed deposit rates start going up a fair amount, we might see more money move from stocks to more fixed income instruments, right? So that is one thing to note. But on the whole, I think India and Indian companies have done fairly well and weathered the COVID storm. And it has shown our resilience, right? That yes, we were affected, that is fine. But we took certain steps. We kind of ran through it. We showed like the rest of the world that India could also function reasonably well in a work from home environment, right? A lot of sectors can't, sadly, like retail and a lot of people, a lot of livelihoods were affected. But I think, so the whole issue of COVID problems are out. And now it's problems of like withdrawing like global liquidity. Everybody removes the emergency liquidity, what they had provided. And so there has to be some sort of a pullback. So it's just that. And hopefully we bounce back, and like how we bounce back from COVID, we bounce back from this episode and come out stronger. Moving on, Pakistan to release 20 fishermen, Indian fishermen next week. So 20 Indian fishermen from Gujarat who had been captured by Pakistan in the past are supposed to be handed over to Indian authorities on 20th June. Nearly 500 fishermen from Gujarat are languishing in jails in Pakistan, out of which 358 were arrested in the last 2 years. So Abhishek, this is like a small step towards what is probably needed.
Yes, I think Indian fishermen do get arrested by both Pakistan and Sri Lanka quite often. As what happens is, while they are doing their fishing activities, they inadvertently cross the maritime boundaries. And obviously, both Pakistan and in the past Sri Lanka has been very active in patrolling these boundaries and arresting Indian fishermen. And so, yeah, as you said, that 500 number would probably shock a lot of people to know that so many are actually languishing in Pakistani jails for fairly innocuous mistakes, right? I don't think there is a single case of anyone actually having any ulterior motive or anything like that. right? Because if there had been any actual criminal elements involved, these countries would have publicized that, right? So it's just the nature of deep sea fishing, and yeah, 20 people is a small number, but hopefully we'll see more in the future. And to be fair, actually, India too arrests from the other side, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a small power flexing that is done by all our countries when it comes to this issue. Yeah.
And moving on, so Reserve Bank of India sold $10 billion, actually it's billion, not million, in FX reserves, as they sought to cushion the domestic imports of transport fuels, so crude oil. This also serves the purpose to prevent the loss in value of rupee. So India's foreign exchange reserves have fallen to slightly below $600 billion. And 10 billion of that was in the last week itself. The peak was $642 billion. But like, again, this is nothing for panic. Prior to the pandemic, we were at about $440 billion. And what happened at that time is because India was in a very stringent lockdown, our oil imports fell dramatically, and even gold imports for that matter. And what India did is they did not let the currency appreciate at that time. They actually hiked fuel taxes, so did not increase demand for fuel like a lot. And at all of that, we went on our reserves from 440 to 640 billion. So we maintained a stable rupee. And now for what did we accumulate those reserves for, right? So basically, it is saving it for a rainy day. And now is the rainy day where you're seeing due to global higher inflation, global supply chains are still clogged. So our import bill is much higher. And at that time where India is importing more than exporting, so we do have like a net trade deficit. In the good times, we were financing it by equity inflows, by foreigners buying our equities, right? And now that has stalled. So to maintain a stable value of the rupee, RBI is actually draining its reserves. So it is quite a prudent measure. It is something which is anticipated, and this was actually planned for and very well managed. So if anything, that is good prudent management. You are saving up for a rainy day, and then this is a time where you actually utilize it. All of these things, actually, I feel that India, with all the steps that India and different organizations, different institutions within India have taken, probably India has become more resilient in this whole period of COVID, right? So probably it's a good sign, rather than being like a fragile situation. The kind of sad example is Sri Lanka, our neighbor, whose economy collapsed during COVID. I think India has shown a reasonably good strength. And so even if there are a lot of alarmist headlines that, oh, Indian reserves fall by $10 billion, but it's okay. They had risen to over $200 billion as well, right? So some of it we are giving back. And hopefully, as things open up and like the supply bottlenecks are all reduced a bit, so Indian import bill comes down, and hopefully India manages to export a lot more as well. So that's about it on the topics for the week. Next week we have a very interesting episode with Ankit Doigar on delivering social welfare, on last mile delivery and women empowerment. Ankit is a co-founder and CEO of Hak Darshak, and this is going to be extremely interesting, given all the social changes and how social welfare is impacting like real bottom of the pyramid and at the grassroots level. So that's it from me and Abhishek. Thank you for watching Bharatvaarta. Please tune in again next week for our weekly, and please watch our episodes during the week as well. Thank you, and Jai Hind.